Woo! Thank you very much. Wow, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks, Patrice, for that introduction. So I want to talk to you a little bit about financial wisdom for entrepreneurs. So for most entrepreneurs, finance is at its best sketchy and at its worst evil. And I think that's a problem, and it's a problem because your enterprises are going to live and die by finance. And so I'm going to try to convince you that finance is actually fantastic, and actually really noble, and actually completely the opposite of what you think it is. So let me tell you how this project that I came about, and let me tell you some of the ideas that come out of it. So 2 years ago, I was asked to give a talk to graduating students. And I thought I would talk about things going on in the capital markets and share buybacks, and I was told that's not what graduating students are supposed to get. They're supposed to get wisdom. So I titled my talk The Wisdom of Finance, because I knew I was supposed to be giving wisdom, and I know something about finance. Unfortunately, then I had to figure out what the heck that meant. And as I went about thinking about it, I realized that there's actually this incredible parallel between finance and philosophy. Finance is about creating value, and for most of us, what we care about in life is, are we creating value? And in fact, there's a really close analog between the big ideas of finance and a lot of the big questions in life that animate us. So I gave this talk, and it was spectacular, and students just reacted really positively. I loved the experience, and they told me that I had to write a book. So it turns out, I didn't really know this, writing a book is different than giving a talk. I thought I could write down my talk and get it published. It doesn't really work that way. To sustain a reader over 6 or 7 hours, you really got to have more than just a talk. And what came about after that was I realized that not only is this correspondence between finance, the big ideas of finance, and life, but I could use stories to make the case. And so the book, which came out last year, is about the wisdom of finance. The subtitle's important. It's the discovering humanity in the world of risk and return. So what's the book about? And what am I here to talk to you about? So the basic idea here is, let me tell you what it's not about. So if you want to value the option embedded in your securities on your term sheets, this is not the book for you. If you want to justify your hockey stick projections, this is not the book for you. If you're looking for the next big stock, not here. This is about something different. This is about the fact that finance has got alienated from the most of commerce. People have demonized it, and as a consequence, people don't want to understand it, and we're now doing things in finance that are really evil as a result. So what can we do to figure this out? And the book has these two basic ideas. We can actually use literature, history, and philosophy to explain finance and to demystify finance. And then the second piece of it is actually the ideas of finance, value creation, optionality, leverage, actually help you think about your life. So what does that mean? This is the epigram to the book. It's money is a kind of poetry. You might think that Wallace Stevens guy is some Gordon Gekko-esque guy who's an investment banker or something. He's actually the greatest American poet of the 20th century. And he spent his life in insurance. And he loved insurance as much as he loved poetry. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. And he understood that actually insurance is spectacular. And the idea of the book is to kind of break down this idea that finance is something separate from our humanity. They're actually closely linked. So what do you get out of this process? So if you are an entrepreneur who is suspicious of finance and who doesn't even want to touch it in many ways, this is a way into finance, only through stories. Not an equation, no graphs, just stories. But the deeper piece of the book, and what I think the project that we all need to be engaged in, is we need to demystify finance and we need to rehabilitate finance. So what does demystify mean? Demystify means finance is being demonized, and finance is too important to demonize. If you're involved in fintech, you know this. It's too important to our lives to actually demonize it, and it's too important to our economy to demonize. At the same time, we need to rehabilitate finance. Chunks of finance are broken. It's 10 years post-financial crisis, and we haven't fixed it. How are we going to fix it? There's a couple of solutions out there. One solution is we just kind of outrage, and we're going to scream at the top of our lungs and occupy. That may be rewarding. It's not going to change anything. We can do regulation. Great. Turns out regulation can be really counterproductive in many ways. The point of the book is to say, get back to the core ideas of finance. They're spectacular, and if we root practice in those big ideas, we can make the practice of finance better. That, in fact, is the only way to make finance better over the longer run. All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit about the book and then talk specifically about how it works out for entrepreneurs and for venture capitalists. So, you know, one of the best parts about the book from my perspective is every chapter has a little picture in front of it. And that's meant to just say, we're going to do all the big ideas of finance, but we're going to do it in totally non-traditional ways. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples of this. This is going to look kind of nasty because it looks like the outline of every textbook in finance there is. In fact, this is the intellectual spine of the book. It's all the big ideas of finance. But here's the trick. We're not going to talk about the big ideas of finance in the normal way. So, for example, when we talk about risk management, instead of talking about it with stochastic calculus and Black-Scholes-Merton formula, we're going to use Jane Austen. Because it turns out at the heart of most Jane Austen novels and Anthony Trollope novels is a big risk management problem. And that risk management problem is, in the case of Pride and Prejudice and in the case of a number of those novels, is the problem of young women who have these suitors come along. Some of them are nice but ugly, some of them are rich but drunk, and you got to figure out that risk management problem. And Austen's clear, men can make mistakes, but young women at that time could not make mistakes. And it's a huge risk management problem. Here's the best part about that analogy. In fact, those characters give voice to the logic of options and diversifications 120 years before modern portfolio theory. These ideas are not new to finance. They're deep in the way we think about the world. And in fact, you have these characters talking about this problem by using the language of options and diversification. Another good example is value creation, core to finance. How do we create value? Well, we can talk about that by talking about cost of capital and how you should beat your cost of capital and so on and so forth. Or you can read the parable of the talents in the Bible. That parable was used by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, to talk about why money and the use of money can actually have great higher purposes. And in fact, what comes out of that parable is, in fact, the recipe for value creation we teach in finance every day. You are stewards for other people's capital. You have a great responsibility when you take on that stewardship role. And you only create value by exceeding their expectations. That translates pretty quickly to beat your cost of capital and do it for as long as you can. Keep on going. Corporate governance, the central problem in most venture settings and in public capital markets. How do we get managers to do what people who actually own the company want them to do? If you want a lesson on that, you can kind of do some crazy incomplete contracting work, or you can go watch The Producers by Mel Brooks. Turns out it's the greatest setting for understanding the principal agent problem that is core to finance. And in fact, Mel Brooks turns out to be a great guide for thinking about the principal agent problem more generally. You know, what's the principal agent problem? Your funder gives you money, they can't watch you all the time, and they're going to try to set up incentives for you to do the right thing. That is the core of modern capitalism. 120 years ago, most of us had the privilege of working for ourselves. The fundamental condition in modern capitalism is the people who own stuff don't control it. And solving that problem is what makes finance so much fun. It actually turns out to have a whole bunch of analogies to how you think about your own life as well. Mergers turn out to be a great guide for thinking about marriages. This is probably the cheekiest chapter, but a lot of what we learn about mergers actually applies to relationships more generally. And then finally, down here, we have leverage. You know, leverage is all about something in finance that's really important, which is how do you get to control more resources than you have a right to? That's debt, and that's leverage. That turns out to have a great analogy for how commitments play a large role in your life more generally. The reason people in finance love leverage is it allows them access to things they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. You get to live in a home you have no right to live in. You get to buy an education you have no right to buy. That same thing is true for commitments you make in your life. And in fact, that picture down at the bottom left is from The Merchant of Venice. It's nominally a play about debt. In fact, it's a play about commitments and love, and like the power of commitments. So again, a big idea in finance has a direct analog for how you think about your life. The last chapter is about why everyone hates finance, which is just meant to say, I just told you all these ideas are fantastic, and yet finance is demonized today. And I try to take a shot at trying to explain why that is. Let me try to zero in on how it can impact the way you kind of behave as an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist. So in particular, I think one of the ways to start thinking about these problems is thinking about how good you are at managing leverage. So in the book, I try to talk about low leverage people and high leverage people. And they're both fantastic. I use the example of George Orwell and Jeff Koons. George Orwell was a low leverage guy. Post-World War II, he was getting sucked dry by commitments in London. He decided to leave. He left everything. He went to the Scottish Islands for 3 years. He wrote 1984. He just gave up all the commitments in the world and came up with this incredible thing. That's a low leverage guy. Who's a high leverage guy? Jeff Koons is a high leverage guy. Arguably the greatest modern American artist. He creates sculptures half the size of the stage. Here's the thing about Jeff Koons. He doesn't even know how to use the material he works with. He hired 150 people in his factory. He's gone bankrupt like 3 times. He bankrupts dealers like every couple of years. That's a high leverage life. But guess what? He gets to create sculptures and create art that got him like a lifelong retrospective in the Whitney Museum. That's a high leverage person. A lot of entrepreneurship is people who are really good in low leverage settings. You like to have span of control, you want to do everything yourself, that's fantastic. The hardest thing in life is to become a high leverage person, where you are now embedded in an organization with commitments to other people. That's a really, really hard thing. How you manage that process is exactly how we think about managing leverage in finance. Optionality is a concept in finance that people in finance love. I have young people come into my office all the time and say, I want more optionality. Now, what does that mean? Well, what are options? I want more choices. I want to be able to go down a path where I get access to more choices. That's what optionality is. In fact, people in finance talk about this all the time. You know, marriage is the death of optionality. That's the way they think about the world. Here's the thing I observe, though, which is all these people who come into my office and they say, I want more optionality. I want higher education so I get more optionality. I want to go to a prestigious firm because I want more optionality. It'll create more choices in the future. Here's the thing I observe, which is the people who talk like that end up being only good at one thing, which is buying optionality. And then they spend the next 30 years buying optionality. And that's the perversity of that logic, which is it's really addictive to keep buying safety nets. Options are meant to actually make you take big risks. And the people who get obsessed with optionality tend to never end up taking the big risks, which is actually where all the value creation comes from. I think a big question you want to ask yourself is whether today you are creating value or extracting value. So there's a lot of things going on in the Valley, there's a lot of things going on in finance that nominally are about creating value. And the reality is far different. It's about extracting value. It can be about extracting value from funders and then distributing it to customers, but it is not really about creating value. You know, fundamentally, you want to ask yourself, over the long run, are you creating value? I think there's a lot of folks in this community, in the finance community, who are not about creating value anymore. They're about extracting value. They kind of dress it up in a different way, but you really want to be careful, and when you think about that, how that actually is working. Final thing I'll just talk to briefly is about one of the great ideas in finance, which is alpha and beta. Underlying story in finance is alpha is, you know, finance nirvana. That means you are generating really true value because you're creating a return above and beyond the risk that you're actually bearing. Beta is the opposite. You're just riding the market and you're getting paid for it. So if you have some hedge fund buddies, they'll say, yeah, I'm really creating alpha. Those guys are just, you know, riding beta. They're just taking the market risk. You want to ask yourself that question yourself, you know, which is, are you really creating alpha? And what does it mean to create alpha? It turns out creating alpha is enormously difficult. And actually, you only know if you create alpha over the really, really long run. So any logic which suggests that, oh yeah, I'm doing something fantastic, I'm a good money manager, I'm a good entrepreneur because of what happened last year, is absolutely false. The logic of these markets is one where you only know if you're good over the very, very long run. And then the final story is the biggest lesson of finance. Why do people in finance sometimes turn out to be kind of jerks? And by the way, as you know, that disease has spread to this entrepreneurial community as well. And the reason for that is because people confuse luck and skill. This happens in finance all the time. People, quote unquote, beat the market for 5 years in a row and they say, I'm the smartest guy in the world. And that leads to really bad behavior. We've seen it over and over again. We see entrepreneurs do the same thing and they mistake outcomes to be a function of their skill and don't understand the force of luck. And that makes them into jerks. The big lesson of finance, of course, is the opposite, which is it's almost impossible to actually separate out luck and skill, but for over the really, really long horizon, like 30, 50 years. And in fact, much of what we observe as good outcomes is in fact the product of luck. That is a lesson in humility. Even if you are wrong about it and you really are skillful, it's a lot better to operate as if you're lucky. Because otherwise you can turn into the jerks that people mock in finance and that people now mock in the Valley as well. So all this is a way of saying, first, if you have evil impressions of finance, it's actually a spectacularly moral and noble world. It's gotten corrupted recently, but you should get yourself into those ideas. If you're in fintech, or if you're an entrepreneur, or you're dealing with people in finance, learn the ideas because they're in fact fantastic. The current manifestation is not always great, but get to know it because as a citizen, as an entrepreneur, you need to understand these things and you need not to be intimidated by them. And in fact, if you want to do that, it turns out the humanities, which most people in the kind of desire to learn STEM are disregarding, actually is the greatest guide to learning finance of all. Because the stories of the humanities actually help you understand all those things in a much more fun way than usual finance approaches. And then finally, maybe we can make finance better. A lot of you are engaged in fintech. You know that finance is broken. You know there are a lot of large institutions extracting tons of value. Well, one of the ways we can make it better is remembering that the actually core ideas are great. It just happens to be that we've gotten a little confused about where value comes from and how to think about value. All right, thank you very much. We have some signed books at the HBX sponsorship thing, and I'd be delighted to meet you there and talk about it and talk a little bit more about the book. Thanks so much.